Time travel has long been a staple of science fiction and a subject of both fascination and skepticism in equal measure. But among the myriad tales that blur the line between reality and fantasy, there are some convincing stories of people who allegedly actually traveled through time. Join us as we dig deep into the most credible time travel stories. Number 1. Two professors see Marie Antoinette at Versailles in 1901. In 1901, two professors from St. Hugh's College in Oxford, England, went to visit the Palace of Versailles. Versailles was, of course, the French royal home until the monarchy was abolished in 1792. Marie Antoinette, one of the last royals to live there, was executed in 1793. So on that day in 1901, when Professors Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were walking the grounds of the palace, it's pretty safe to say they did not expect to see Marie Antoinette in the flesh just chillin' on a stool outside the Petit Trianon, a private retreat built for Antoinette by her hubby, Louis XVI. However, something extraordinary happened. They were transported back to the 18th century, where they glimpsed the Queen on what may have been the last happy day of her life. As Moberly and Jourdain later wrote about their experience in their book An Adventure, they took a tour and then decided to spend some time sitting in the Hall of Mirrors. They decided their next step was Petit Trianon. But on their way, they got lost and began to feel something was off. They decided to stop and ask directions from two men dressed in greenish jackets and tricorn hats. They assumed they were gardeners because of a wheelbarrow nearby. The women continued toward the Trianon on the men's directions, but things soon took an eerie turn.
I began to feel as if I were walking in my sleep. The heavy dreaminess was oppressive. At last, we came upon a path crossing ours, and saw in front of us a building consisting of some columns roofed in and set back in the trees. Seated on the steps was a man with a heavy black cloak round his shoulders and wearing a slouch hat. At that moment, the eerie feeling which had begun in the garden culminated in a definite impression of something uncanny and fear-inspiring. The man slowly turned his face, which was marked by smallpox. His complexion was very dark. The expression was very evil and yet unseeing. I felt a repugnance to going past him.
As they walked, one of the women observed a pretty woman with pretty blonde hair wearing a hat. She was sitting and sketching and completely oblivious to the fact that two women were gaping at her and all the other people in 1780s period attire who had appeared just as suddenly as Antoinette. Antoinette and everyone else disappeared when a tour guide approached Moberly and Jourdain. The story then gained notoriety because of how grounded it seemed. Many people set out to bolster this story in true academic fashion by combing through the French National Archives and extensively researching French history. They compared maps of the Versailles grounds from 1789 and 1901, analyzed the clothing, and made several return visits in an attempt to prove that the Versailles they experienced was that of the 18th century rather than the 20th. They concluded that the two gardeners in green were members of the Queen's Swiss Guard. The scary man was Comte de Vaudreuil, who played a role in betraying the Queen. The pretty woman in the shady hat was Marie Antoinette herself. And the running man was the page who informed her of the mob. Otherwise, as told, both Moberly and Jourdain were two highly educated and well-respected women. They wouldn't just make up a story like that. So what was it? Did they actually travel through time? It's one of the most thoroughly reported, compelling, and famous time travel stories that can't be explained. Number 2. Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard sees a futuristic plane. Back in 1935, when Goddard was still a wing commander, he was instructed to inspect an inactive airbase located in Drem, near Edinburgh in Scotland. While flying over it, Goddard found the airbase to be in a poor state with cattle grazing on the wild grass that had now forced its way through the tarmac. it was in complete shambles. Later on, while flying his biplane, he got into a bit of trouble thanks to the harsh weather conditions. To avoid an accident, Goddard decided to fly back to the airbase till the weather cleared out a bit. But when he approached the landing strip, something very strange happened. The clouds cleared, the sun shone brightly, and he saw that the previously abandoned land was now bustling with mechanics in blue jumpsuits. There were 4 yellow planes on the tarmac, and one of them was a kind he had never seen before. And that's just so weird. Keep in mind, this guy was a military pilot. He was pretty familiar with all the different plane models available at the time. That's why Goddard was totally confused. Had he imagined it? Was he hallucinating? Was it a dream? It couldn't be real, certainly. But 4 years later, Goddard has completely changed his mind when he was sent back to the airfield. Far from being abandoned, it was now in full use, complete with blue jumpsuit wearing mechanics and yellow planes. And sitting on the runway was the plane he couldn't identify in 1935, a Miles Magister. The Magister was first manufactured in 1938, 3 years after Goddard initially saw it. Full déjà vu moment. At that time, Goddard strongly believed he traveled ahead in time to 1939 and then back to 1935. On that day, his plane almost crashed. But did it hold true? Skeptics say that Goddard might have simply been confused about his location, but that's too simple an explanation. Also, could an acclaimed officer like him make such an elementary mistake? Sir Goddard passed away in 1987, so I guess we'll never have an answer. Regardless, Goddard's story is convincing because he wasn't even trying to travel through time. Something unexplainable just happened to him. Number 3. Journalist experiences air raid, 11 years before it occurs. In 1932, journalist J. Bernard Hutton and photographer Joachim Brandt were sent by a German newspaper to do a story on the Hamburg shipyard. It was an uneventful visit until the bombs began raining down on them. Hutton and Brandt realized they were caught in the middle of an air raid and hightailed it out of there, but not before snapping some photographs. When they got back to the center of Hamburg, no one believed their story. They developed the photos they took, intending to prove to everyone that they weren't crazy. In fact, they proved the opposite. The photos showed no signs of an air raid. 11 years later, Hutton was living in London when he opened up a newspaper and probably nearly spit his coffee across his desk. There was a story about Operation Gomorrah, an air raid on Hamburg. Interestingly, the accompanying photos looked exactly like what he experienced in 1932. But how? Number 4. British government worker traveled to 8973. William Taylor, who said he worked in British intelligence in the early 2000s, unveiled that he was sent to the year 8973 in a secret time machine to find out more about the future.
I can't believe I'm making this video because I have contemplated doing so for a long time. It's time to finally come clean. It's time to tell the public the truth. It's time to tell you, whoever is out there watching.
What Taylor claimed he found was a utopia with no disease, death, or crime. Humans were gone and replaced with human-robot hybrids, but Earth still existed, one of many planets these beings had colonized in a bid to find more space. He insists that the government has a wealth of advanced technologies that are being kept secret from the public, but admits that some of it will be released to the general public by 2028, just a decade from now. Taylor also claims that there have been attempts to move the whole world onto another timeline, with technology discovered in crashed extraterrestrial crafts which have landed on Earth. Number 5. South Fork Bridge Hipster. In 1941, the South Fork Bridge in British Columbia, Canada reopened and someone snapped a photo. Contained within the crowd of pedestrians is a possible anomaly, a man wearing sunglasses with what looks like a logo t-shirt under his sweater. While he might pass for a modern hipster today, next to the others in the photo, he looks incredibly out of place, While skeptics have pointed out that all of his clothing was available for purchase at the time, his choice in wardrobe still feels anachronistic. Was this man a time traveler or just ahead of his time? Before we get to our top pick, here are a few honorable mentions. Jofar Vorin. This man claimed to be from a country called Laxaria, Father Ernetti's chronovisor. This Italian priest and scientist, allegedly, built a time viewer. W.D. Davis, a time traveler. From 2200, on the other hand, note that this is not the first time that a time traveler has seemingly starred in an image. Around 10 years before the hipster snap was taken, footage was taken of a woman holding a piece of technology that wasn't invented until many years later. The unearthed footage shows a group of women walking down some stairs, one lady who stands out of the crowd due to her clothing, and how she is seemingly holding a mobile phone as if she is taking a phone call. Number 6. The Liverpool time slips and mysterious occurrences in Bold Street. In 1996, a police officer named Frank and his wife out for a stroll in Liverpool town center. His wife decided that she wanted to go and buy a book at Waterstones, the large bookstore, and they started to walk towards the area of the shop. As they approached Bold Street, Frank decided to go to another shop first, but bumped into his friend and stopped to chat in the street. His wife went ahead without him. A few moments later, Frank said goodbye, visited his shop, and turned to go back to meet his wife. After reaching Bold Street, he headed on towards the bookstore. As he approached, he glanced up and was surprised to see the name Cripps above the door. As he was about to cross over to see what was going on, a van swept past him with the name Cardines on the side. The van driver honked his old-fashioned horn and drove past. Looking around, Frank suddenly realized that things were not quite what they should be. He looked at the cars driving past and realized that they were all old-fashioned vehicles, such as people would drive back in the 50s and 60s. And then he noticed the people. Men were wearing hats and macks, and the women were dressed in headscarves, full skirts, and had old-fashioned hairstyles, such as women wore just after the war. By this time, Frank was beginning to feel slightly freaked out. He carried on crossing the road and headed towards the store. As he got closer, he noticed in the window there were handbags, shoes, and umbrellas. Suddenly, he saw a young woman looking up at the shop sign. She looked confused. She was wearing modern clothes, and as she saw him approaching, she smiled at him. Frank went into the shop, closely followed by the young women. When they entered, he was surprised and pleased to see that it had indeed turned back into a bookshop. The young woman smiled, shook her head, and said, "That was strange. I thought it was a new clothes shop." Then she walked away, looking extremely puzzled. This may sound an unlikely tale, but the odd thing about it is that Frank was, in fact, a former police officer who was used to dealing in facts and definitely wasn't the type of person who would believe in the paranormal. Frank never stopped talking about it. Was this a time slip? Evidently, Cripps was a women's shop that sold clothes and other goods decades before, and Cardines was also a well-known Liverpool firm that owned vans around the same time. Number 7. The Man from Torrid. In 1954, a man trying to get through customs at Haneda Airport in Tokyo, Japan, had a bit of trouble with the customs agents. It wasn't because he forgot to declare something on his customs form, but because he claimed to be from a country that didn't exist, and he had a passport and stamps to prove it. His passport was from a country named Torrid, which he claimed was in between Spain and France. When customs officials pulled out a map and asked him if he meant Andorra, he became angry. He said that yes, the location was right, but Torrid had existed for at least 1,000 years. He had never heard of Andorra. He was given a hotel room for the night while the police tried to figure out what was happening. Even though there were armed guards posted outside his room, the man had vanished by the next morning. His passport, which had been stored in the security office at the airport, was also gone. Officials never figured out the mystery of the man from Torrid. Number 8. Jofar Vorin claimed to be from Laxaria. In 1850, a man named Jofar Vorin was found in Frankfurt on the Oder, Germany, and questioned. He spoke very broken German, which made his claims even more difficult to understand. He said he was from Laxaria and spoke the languages Laxarian and Abramian. He said he was in search of his long-lost brother, but he was shipwrecked on the way to his destination. Vorin didn't recognize any of the maps or globes that were presented to him. He claimed that the world as he knew it had 5 sections: Sakria, Aflar, Aslar, Auslar, and Uplar. In the Yearbook of Facts in Science and Art, John Timms reports Vorin was taken to Berlin to be questioned and studied. There's no doubt that Vorin existed. The question is, was he crazy? Or was he from a very distant future? Number 9. 4 friends travel from 1979 to 1905. In 1979, Jeff and Pauline Simpson and Len and Cynthia Gisby were traveling through France. When it became late, they decided to find a hotel for the night. They found a place not too far down the road they were traveling. It was an odd place. The doors to the rooms only had wooden latches, no locks, and the windows only had thick shutters, no glass. In the morning, they had breakfast at the hotel and encountered 2 gendarmes, armed French policemen, that were wearing old-looking uniforms, complete with capes. The whole experience at the hotel seemed strange, not least because their stay only cost 19 francs. Other hotels in the area cost over 200 francs. Still, they happily went on their way, and on their return journey, tried to stop and stay at the hotel again. Except it had seemingly vanished into thin air. And the uniforms those gendarmes were wearing, they were from around 1905. Number 10. Sergei Ponomarenko. The origins of Ponomarenko's story are as mysterious as the story itself. It first caught public attention through a series of documentaries and internet forums, where it was presented with a mixture of intrigue and skepticism. The most notable coverage of his tale comes from a Ukrainian documentary titled The Time Traveler, which aired in the mid-2000s. This documentary played a pivotal role in bringing the Ponomarenko story to the forefront of public curiosity. In the documentary, the narrative begins in April 2006, when an individual, appearing perplexed and out of place, was encountered in the streets of Kyiv, Ukraine's bustling capital. The man, whose attire was distinctly reminiscent of the 1950s Soviet Union, was described as being in a state of apparent confusion and disorientation. He introduced himself as Sergei Ponomarenko and was shocked that he was in the 21st century. He claimed no recollection or understanding of how he had traveled from his time to the present day. What further complicated the story was the fact that he was in possession of a camera that was no longer in use. In specific, the camera in question was identified as a Zenit, a popular brand extensively used in the Soviet Union during the 1950s. The intrigue intensified when the undeveloped film inside the camera was processed. Notably, the quality and condition of the film were consistent with photographic materials from the 1950s. The film showed signs of age, but had been remarkably well preserved, considering the decades that had supposedly passed since its exposure. The images that emerged were not only consistent with the photographic techniques of the mid-20th century, but also depicted scenes and subjects that resonated with that period. These photographs included urban landscapes of Kyiv, showcasing architectures and street scenes that were recognizable yet distinctly different from their modern-day counterparts, hinting at a bygone era. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the incident was the photograph he carried. It was an image of a young woman, seemingly from the same era as Ponomarenko's attire. The photograph, aged yet well-preserved, was developed from the film in Ponomarenko's camera. This picture became a focal point of the mystery, as it raised numerous questions. Who was the woman in the photograph? Was she a loved one, or did she hold some other significance in Ponomarenko's life? The emotional value he seemed to place on this photograph suggested a deep personal connection. The mystery deepened when experts analyzed the photograph. The style, the composition, and the development technique all pointed to it being genuine, and from the era Ponomarenko claimed to be from. However, the absence of any records or identifiable features in the image made it impossible to verify its origins or the identity of the woman. The documentary delved into these aspects of Ponomarenko's account, examining the implications and raising questions about the nature of time and reality. While it stopped short of providing definitive answers, it succeeded in weaving a narrative that was both compelling and thought-provoking, igniting discussions and debates across various platforms, including internet forums dedicated to mysteries and unexplained phenomena. Number 11. A 20th century doctor finds himself in the 1800s. In 1935, Dr. E.G. Moon was leaving the residence of one of his patients in Kent, England, when he realized his car was not where he had left it. Both the driveway and the road seemed a lot rougher than he remembered. Dr. Moon spotted a man walking by the house, and he realized that the man was wearing several capes and a top hat, and carrying a long-barreled gun. He looked to Moon like he was from the 19th century, not the 20th. Dr. Moon turned to go back to the house, but as he did, he saw that the driveway was paved again, and his car was once again parked in it. He turned back towards the road to look for the man, but he had vanished. Number 12. A mysterious man come from the year 2036. In November 2000, the Time Travel Institute forums saw a spike in unusual activity. Nestled among the usual conspiracy theories and far-fetched UFO sightings were a string of posts from a man who called himself John Teeter. He claimed to be from the year 2036, saying the government sent him back in time to 1975 to retrieve an IBM computer, which they needed in order to debug some computer programs. He hopped off his time machine in 2000 for personal reasons, and since he was already there, he decided to warn everyone about how crappy the future was going to get. He claimed that civil unrest would begin in the United States in 2004, and there would be a full-blown civil war by 2012. By 2015, he said, a quick World War III would have come and gone. Of course, none of these things have happened, so you're probably wondering, why did people believe this wingnut? It's because his posts about time travel were so detailed, the description of its mechanics and his machine so thorough, that it seemed almost impossible that he wasn't telling the truth. Number 13. Two men from 1969 drive straight to the 1940s. In 1969, two men were having lunch in a southwestern Louisiana town. Afterward, they got in their car and headed back to work along U.S. Route 167, a highway that spans much of the state. In the distance, they saw an old car. As they got closer to it, they realized it was moving very slowly, and they could see the year 1940 printed on its license plate. The two men pulled up alongside the car and peered in to see if everything was okay. They were greeted by the sight of a woman done up in full 1940s regalia and a small child, both of whom looked very confused and even, they thought, frightened. They gestured to the woman, indicating that she should pull over and they would help her. As she began to pull onto the side of the road, the two men stopped a few yards in front of her. When they turned around to make sure she had parked safely, the whole car had vanished into thin air. Number 14. Preston Nichols and Al Bielek claim they were part of the alleged Montauk Project. At an Air Force base in Montauk, NY, at the eastern tip of Long Island, Preston Nichols claims some top-secret government time travel experiments took place. Nichols writes in The Montauk Project, experiments in time that in the 1980s he recovered repressed memories of working on the project. And his claims seem outlandish. They experimented on children. One child had psychic abilities. They created a time portal to 1943. But not just any moment in 1943. The portal opened up onto the USS Eldridge, the subject of another famous alleged government project, the Philadelphia experiment. Proponents of the Philadelphia experiment conspiracy theory purport that, at the height of World War II, the U.S. conducted a series of tests to try and cloak its warships. They wanted their ships to be invisible and undetectable. In October 1943, they reportedly succeeded, but there was a side effect. The Eldridge traveled back 10 minutes in time, and the experience drove the crew mad. They were brainwashed afterward, their memories wiped of the whole incident. A film about these alleged events, The Philadelphia Experiment, was released in 1984. And wouldn't you know it, that film triggered some repressed memories in one Al Bielek, who claimed he was part of the Philadelphia Experiment. Al Bielek claimed until his death that he spent time in two separate periods of the future, before returning to the present to reveal his unbelievable story. He even recorded a 90-minute lecture of himself describing how he traveled through time, what he saw, and why it happened. And that's a series of truly unbelievable revelations. The little that is known for certain about Al's life is that he was born in 1927. Known as a strange child in his own words, he claimed his first memory was when he was just 9 months old. At a family Christmas party, he found he was able to fully understand the adults talking in the room around him. When he was just 16, he joined the U.S. Navy to help fight the Nazis. It was at this time in 1943, serving as a lowly naval officer aboard the USS Eldridge, that Al claimed he traveled in time. The Eldridge was supposedly harboring the Philadelphia experiment. On August 13, 1943, Bielek and his brother Duncan jumped off the ship to escape a strange light and landed in the year 2137. Bielek claimed the pair awoke in a hospital bed with no recollection of how they got there. The first sign that something was wrong was that the room had a wall-mounted color TV, very unusual for 1943. They were told by hospital staff that they had suffered severe radiation burns, not from a nuclear attack, but from the radiation found in deep space. Bielek claimed they were told that there were very few surviving cities around the world and no more national boundaries or government. Eventually, the pair asked to see maps of the world and were reportedly stunned by how much it had changed in the preceding 2 centuries. As Bielek explained, much of California was now underwater, stretching to the San Andreas fault line, and there was not much left of Los Angeles as a functioning city. Many major U.S. cities such as Chicago, New Orleans, and San Diego were gone, while rising sea levels had seen the Great Lakes become one giant body of water, and the Mississippi River widen, becoming 30 miles wide at its narrowest point. In Europe, he said most of England had gone, while the Scottish Highlands and some of Ireland remained. Much of Europe was underwater, even parts of Switzerland. Most dramatically, he claimed that when he asked a hospital technician, he was told that the world's population had plummeted to just 300 million. He said he learned that most of the world's governments had crumbled away by the year 2025. A nuclear World War III killed millions, but, he claimed, far more were wiped out by changes to the Earth. Bielek said that one day he was walking around the hospital grounds when he was transported even further ahead in time to around the year 2750. By this point, society had drastically changed. Many cities had gone, but floating cities now existed, thanks to anti-gravity techniques, some of them stretching more than 2.5 miles into the sky. The countries of the world had all gone, and instead most people lived in a series of self-governing city-states. Bielek said that these city-states had no elected or appointed government. Instead, each city was run by an intelligent computer with synthetic intelligence, called the Synthetic Intelligence Computer System, that worked telepathically. It was illegal for humans to leave certain zones, and the governing supercomputers had the ability to terminate offending individuals there and then. Bielek claimed he had spoken to the computer and asked it how such a system of governance came to be. He was told that the project had started a couple of centuries earlier, around the year 2600. No militaries existed, as technology had made conflict practically impossible, and everything was now free. He said he stayed there for 2 years before being sent back to 2137 to pick up his brother. Eventually, Bielek claimed he was sent back in time, but not to the period he had come from. Instead, he appeared in 1983 on August 12th, just after 2 a.m. There, he claimed he met Dr. John von Neumann, the Hungarian-American mathematician. This is despite the fact Dr. von Neumann died in 1957, some quarter of a century earlier. He convinced the two brothers to return to their original time and stop the Philadelphia experiment from ever happening. After his time in the Navy, Bielek said he was recruited by military contractors who revealed that the U.S. military was secretly adapting alien technology and forwarding research on psychic operations. Soon afterwards, he was recruited to the Montauk Project, a conspiracy theory that alleges that the U.S. government conducted secret projects in Montauk, New York, including for psychological warfare and time travel. He even claimed he was able to travel to Mars on several occasions, as well as to a research station in the year 100,000 BC. But sadly, once he came forward with his wacky theories in the year 1990, Bielek said the U.S. government disowned him. Bielek, who now insisted his real name was Edward Cameron and that he had been living for more than 100 years, believed the government didn't try to silence him because his experiments in time travel locked him into the current timeline. Al Bielek passed away officially on October 10, 2011 in Guadalajara, Mexico, at the age of 84. He always claimed he had regressed to a 9-month-old baby in 1927. That's all the information that we have for you today. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell so you never miss out on future episodes. And be sure to also tell us what you think about today's content. Everyone's support motivates us to continue delivering quality content and to always improve. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.